I'm pregnant. Victoria's voice rang through the living room, dripping with satisfaction as she caressed her still flat stomach. And as your father's widow, I've decided his fortune will go to my child, my true heir. The crystal tumbler in my hand felt suddenly heavy as I watched my stepmother's lips curl into a triumphant smile. The same living room where I'd spent countless evenings with my father now felt foreign, filled with relatives who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My name is Alexandra Morgan, and at 28, I was watching my stepmother of 3 years attempt to erase my father's legacy with a single announcement. Dad had passed away 6 months ago, and Victoria had wasted no time asserting her control over everything he built. Alexandra, she said, my name rolling off her tongue like something distasteful. I know this might be difficult for you to accept, but surely you understand that your father would have wanted his grandchild to inherit everything. I met her gaze steadily, though my heart was pounding. Victoria had always been good at this, twisting situations to her advantage while maintaining a veneer of reasonable concern. She perfected that act while dating my father, playing the role of caring stepmother-to-be. My father's wishes were quite clear in his will, I said carefully, setting down my glass. The company. The will can be changed, Victoria cut in smoothly. As his widow and the mother of his unborn child, I have certain rights. My lawyers have already begun the process. The room fell silent. I could feel my Aunt Eleanor's sympathetic gaze from across the room, could see my cousin Michael's hands tighten into fists, but no one spoke up. Victoria's influence over the family had grown steadily since my father's death, aided by her control of the purse strings. What Victoria didn't know, what I kept carefully hidden, was that my father had seen this coming. The night before his cancer took a turn for the worse, he called me to his study. I remember every detail, the smell of his favorite leather chair, the way the lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the intensity in his eyes as he handed me a small key. Alexandra, he'd said, his voice weak but urgent, there are things you need to know. Things about the company, about Victoria. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National. Whatever happens, don't let her know about it until the time is right. Now, watching Victoria hold court in my childhood home, I thought about that key safely tucked away in my apartment. I hadn't visited the safety deposit box yet. Something in my father's tone that night had told me to wait, to be patient. Of course, Victoria continued, settling back into my father's favorite armchair like a queen on her throne. I'll make sure you're taken care of, Alexandra. A modest monthly allowance should suffice. After all, we wouldn't want you to struggle. The condescension in her voice made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. How thoughtful of you, Victoria. She smiled, clearly mistaking my calm for resignation. I'm glad you understand. It's what your father would have wanted, his grandchild continuing his legacy, not. She paused, her eyes sliding over my business suit with barely concealed disdain. Well, not someone who never quite fit into the business world. That last bar was calculated, designed to sting. Victoria had spent the last 3 years subtly undermining my position at Morgan Industries, the company my father had built from the ground up. She questioned my decisions in board meetings, spread rumors about my competence, and gradually pushed me out of key projects. But what she didn't know was that I'd been watching, learning, documenting everything. Every questionable decision, every manipulated financial report, every instance of her using company resources for personal gain. My father had taught me well, sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent think they had the upper hand. Well, my Aunt Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. This is certainly unexpected news. Victoria beamed, one hand still resting on her stomach. Isn't it wonderful? A new heir for the Morgan family. Fresh blood. I stood up, smoothing down my skirt. Congratulations, Victoria. If you'll excuse me, I have some work to attend to. Oh, don't worry about work, Victoria said sweetly. I'm making some changes to the company structure. You should take some time off, rest. All this stress can't be good for you. As I walked out of the house, I could feel her satisfied gaze on my back. She thought she'd won, thought she finally pushed me out of my father's legacy completely. Let her think that, I decided. Let her enjoy her moment of triumph. That evening, I sat in my apartment, turning the small key over in my hands. For 6 months, I'd honored my father's implicit request to wait. But now, watching Victoria attempt to steal not just my inheritance, but my place in the company my father had built, I knew it was time. I called my own lawyer, Marcus Chen, not the family lawyer Victoria had wrapped around her finger. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" he asked when I explained the situation. "Yes," I replied, my voice firm. "Victoria's pregnancy changes things. We need to know what's in that safety deposit box." The next morning, Marcus met me at First National Bank. The safety deposit box was smaller than I expected, but when I opened it, I understood why my father had been so insistent about keeping it secret. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Financial records, emails, photographs, all meticulously organized and annotated in my father's careful handwriting. But what caught my eye was a letter on top, addressed to me in his familiar scrawl. "My dearest Alexandra," it began, "if you're reading this, then things have probably gone exactly as I feared they would. Victoria is not who she pretends to be, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I read the letter twice, my hands shaking slightly. Then I looked up at Marcus, who had been quietly reviewing the other documents. He paused, shuffling through the papers with growing excitement. "This is incredible. Your father built a case against her. Financial fraud, embezzlement, corporate espionage. It's all here." I nodded, remembering the last time I'd seen my father alive, the knowing look in his eyes when he'd given me the key. He'd known Victoria would try to take everything, had prepared for it even as cancer was stealing his strength. "There's more," I said, pulling out another document from the bottom of the box. "Proof that she's done this before. 2 other wealthy men, both dead within years of marrying her. Both fortunes mysteriously transferred before their deaths." Marcus whistled softly. "Your father was thorough. But why didn't he expose her himself?" I thought about it, remembering how tired he'd been in those final months, how Victoria had barely left his side, monitoring every conversation, every visitor. He couldn't, I realized. She watched him too closely. This was his way of fighting back, giving me the weapons I'd need when the time came. Over the next few days, I maintained my routine, letting Victoria think she'd successfully pushed me aside. I went to work, kept my head down, and quietly began putting my father's plan into motion. Victoria, flushed with her apparent victory, grew bolder. She called a board meeting to announce her pregnancy and her plans to restructure the company leadership. I sat quietly in the back, watching her hold court at the head of the table, my father's seat. "As you all know," she said, practically glowing with satisfaction, "Morgan Industries is entering a new era. With my child on the way, we need to think about the future, about legacy." I caught several board members glancing my way uncomfortably. They'd known my father, had watched me grow up in this company, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. "Of course," Victoria continued, "some changes will be necessary. Alexandra," she turned to me with false sympathy, "I think it's best if you take an extended leave. For your own good, really." I met her gaze calmly. "Whatever you think is best, Victoria." She smiled, clearly pleased by my apparent submission. But as she turned back to the board to continue outlining her plans, she didn't notice me checking my phone, confirming that everything was ready for tomorrow. That night, I could hardly sleep, thinking about what was to come. I reread my father's letter, drawing strength from his words. "You are stronger than she knows, Alexandra. Smarter. She sees what she wants to see, a threat to be eliminated. Show her what I've always seen, a daughter worthy of everything I built." The next morning dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully, choosing my father's favorite suit of mine, a charcoal gray ensemble he'd said made me look every inch a Morgan. Victoria had scheduled another board meeting, planning to formally announce the changes to my position in the company. As I walked into the office, I caught whispers and sympathetic glances from employees who'd known me since I was a child. They'd watched me work my way up from summer internships to department head, earning every promotion through merit rather than nepotism. "Good morning, Alexandra," Victoria's assistant called out with forced cheerfulness. "The meeting's been moved to the main conference room to accommodate additional attendees." I nodded, knowing exactly why she'd chosen the larger venue. Victoria always did love an audience for her performances. When I entered the conference room, I found it packed. Not just board members, but department heads, legal teams, and even some major shareholders. Victoria sat at the head of the table, resplendent in a designer maternity dress that probably cost more than most employees' monthly salary. Alexandra, she said, her voice carrying across the room. I'm so glad you could join us for this transition meeting. I took my seat quietly, noting how she positioned me near the door, symbolically and literally as far from power as possible. Marcus Chen slipped in behind me, taking an inconspicuous position against the wall. As you all know, Victoria began, standing to address the room. Morgan Industries is entering an exciting new chapter. With my child, Robert's child, on the way, we need to ensure the company's future is secure. She went on, outlining her plans for restructuring, carefully crafting each point to sound reasonable, necessary. I watched the faces around the room, some nodding in agreement, others carefully blank, a few showing flickers of discomfort. And finally, she said, turning to me with practiced sympathy, we need to discuss Alexandra's role. While we appreciate her efforts over the years, it's time for a change in leadership. Effective immediately. Actually, I cut in, my voice clear and steady. I think it's time we discuss your role, Victoria. The room fell silent. Victoria's smile froze, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face before she recovered. Alexandra, dear, she said smoothly, I know this is difficult, but… Marcus, I called out, would you please distribute the documents? My lawyer stepped forward, passing out thick folders to each person in the room. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she opened hers, then widened as she began to read. What is this? She demanded, her voice rising slightly. That, I said, standing up, is my father's real legacy. Not just his money or his company, but the truth about who you really are. I walked to the front of the room, taking out my own copy of the documents. Before his death, my father compiled quite an interesting file on you, Victoria. Would you like me to share the highlights? Her face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain control. This is ridiculous. These documents are clearly fabricated. Like the financial reports you've been falsifying? I asked, turning to page 3. Or perhaps like the offshore accounts you've been funneling company money into. The same pattern you used with your previous 2 husbands before they conveniently passed away. Gasps echoed around the room. Victoria's hand trembled as she flipped through the pages. This proves nothing, she snapped, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. Actually, Marcus spoke up, it proves quite a lot. Financial fraud, embezzlement, possible criminal conspiracy. Mr. Morgan was very thorough in his documentation. I turned to address the board members directly. My father knew what Victoria was doing. He spent his last months gathering evidence, protecting this company, his life's work, from someone who saw it as nothing more than another conquest. Victoria slammed her hand on the table. I'm carrying Robert's child. You can't. About that, I interrupted, pulling out one final document. We took the liberty of investigating the fertility clinic you claim to have used. Interesting that they have no record of you as a patient. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria's face contorted with rage as her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. You little bitch, she hissed, quiet enough that only I could hear. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I leaned closer, keeping my voice equally low. No, Victoria, you had no idea who you were dealing with. You saw what you wanted to see. A naive daddy's girl you could easily push aside. That was your mistake. Turning back to the room, I raised my voice. I've already provided copies of these documents to the SEC, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and the District Attorney's Office. Victoria isn't just losing her position here. She's facing serious criminal charges. The next hour was chaos. Security escorted Victoria from the building as she screamed threats and accusations. Board members huddled with legal teams, reviewing the evidence. Throughout it all, I maintained my composure, just as my father had taught me. Later that evening, as I sat in my father's old office, my office now, I found myself looking at his photo on the desk. The same knowing smile I remember from our last conversation seemed to shine back at me. You were right, Dad, I whispered, running my fingers over the frame. She never saw it coming. The weeks that followed were intense. Victoria was arrested trying to board a private plane to a non-extradition country. The pregnancy was revealed as a complete fabrication, just another tool in her manipulation arsenal. The investigation uncovered even more than my father had found. A pattern of fraud and deception stretching back years. 3 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching Victoria being sentenced for her crimes. She'd lost everything. Her freedom, her stolen wealth, and most importantly, her power over my father's legacy. As security led her away, she turned to glare at me one last time. I met her gaze steadily, thinking about how different things might have been if she actually seen me for who I was instead of who she assumed I was. The company recovered quickly once the truth came out. Employees and board members rallied around me, many admitting they'd had doubts about Victoria but had been afraid to speak up. Under my leadership, Morgan Industries not only stabilized but began to grow in new directions. 1 year after Victoria's downfall, I stood at my father's grave, placing fresh flowers beside his headstone. The mourning was quiet, peaceful, so different from the chaos of the past year. "I wish you could see it, Dad," I said softly. "The company's stronger than ever. Your legacy is secure. And I finally understand why you always told me that knowledge was more valuable than money." I touched the smooth stone, remembering all the lessons he'd taught me. About business, about people, about patience and timing. He'd known that Victoria would try to take everything, but he'd also known that I was strong enough to stop her. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Another of Victoria's hidden accounts had been discovered, and the recovered funds would be returned to the company. I smiled, thinking about how she underestimated not just me, but the power of a father's love and foresight. Back at the office, I settled into my chair, my father's chair, and looked out over the city skyline. A photo on my desk caught my eye. Me at age 7, sitting on my father's lap in this very office, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. Victoria had thought his legacy was about money, about power and control. She'd never understood that his true legacy was what he'd built in me: strength, wisdom, and the patience to wait for the right moment to fight back. The intercom buzzed, my assistant announcing the start of another board meeting. I gathered my papers, straightened my jacket, and headed for the conference room. The company needed me, and I was ready, just as my father had always known I would be. As I walked into the meeting, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, I saw what my father must have seen all along, not just his daughter, but his true heir, capable of protecting and building upon everything he created. Victoria had thought she could erase me from my father's legacy. Instead, she'd forced me to prove just how much of his daughter I really was, and that, in the end, was worth more than any inheritance she could have